Welcome to this first session of the 2017-18 Pipeline Series. This is a first for us in that we have a panel discussion today, which all of us are keenly looking forward to. Hopefully, everybody has had lunch and dessert. If not, please feel free to do so. Thank you all for taking the time to attend this event. Ultimately, in addition to the great speakers we have, it's the audience that makes events like this a success. We are very pleased to offer this talk through the center, which was formed in 2012 in partnership with the Van Horn Institute. And the Van Horn Institute also has of many valuable events, and I invite you to check them out on their website, which is the Van Horn or the vanhorninstitute.com. Offering a talk like this is relevant for both academia and practice, and it's just one of the ways that the center is fulfilling its mission. The center has had major financial support from CN Rail, Talisman Repsol Energy, Alliance Pipeline, as well as an anonymous individual. This seminar is, of course, funded by Alliance Pipeline, and hence we are able to offer it free of cost. Therefore, much appreciation is due to Alliance Pipeline. We would appreciate it if you could give us permission to send you information about future events by providing your email or business card at the registration desk. We are, of course, thrilled to have our speakers, and I will, as soon as we are done, I will invite them to come to the podium. So Janice Davis, who is the Senior Vice President, Supply Chain and Chief Procurement Officer at Shaw Communications. Mark Lenero, Vice President, Supply Chain Management at Cenovus. And Kurt Ritzy, Consulting Partner at Deloitte's Vancouver office. In the interest of time, I'm not detailing their very impressive bios verbally, but you do have a copy of it at your table. Suffice to say that they're all very senior and experienced professionals in supply chain management. So the plan for today is for each of them to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes and then open the floor for questions. And we do plan to conclude by 1 p.m. So now I'd like to invite our speakers. So Janice, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Jaydeep, and welcome to everybody here for joining us, and thank you. I know your time is precious. So Jaydeep has asked us to talk to you a little bit about bringing forward automotive supply chain tools into other industries. And I've got a couple notes here to make sure that I stick to my 5 to 7 minutes, otherwise my team knows I'll go on a little bit too long. The reality is, within any industry, there's always the good, bad, and the ugly. And I'm a firm believer that you learn from all of these. And it's equally as important what you bring forward, what good tools you bring forward, and what tools or techniques that you choose to leave behind. I think I don't need to tell anybody in this room, but we all know that the reason that people bring in industries, and the automotive is no different, you bring in supply chain practices because you have a burning platform. And automotive was no different. Back in the 1950s, again, as the people in this room know, Edward Deming came to the US auto companies and said, look, I've got some tools and techniques. We would love to be able to bring forward quality products built efficiently at a very right price, whatever that price is. And the auto industry in the US, at least the big three, for a variety of reasons. One, they probably were having great profits. Two, they were stuck in the way of how they did things. They didn't listen to Deming for decades. Deming went to Japan. The Asian automotive companies, from his practices, as we all know today, really started the Toyota production system, became extremely efficient and started eating away at both the profits and the customer base of the US industry. Hence, when they finally woke up, they had a burning platform and a need to be able to utilize and start growing supply chain practices. So therefore, again, it's competition and it's the reducing margins that it's not just in automotive, but it's in industries across the board We're seeing more competition, both traditional competition and non-traditional competition. And we recognize, and industries are recognizing, that if they don't bring forward these practices, they no longer will have a sustainable business plan. They need to improve margin, whether it's to increase cash flow to put into new technology or just to improve overall EBITDA. So what are some of those tools and techniques, per your question, Jaydeep? And these are my humble opinion. Anybody you talk to, of course, is going to give you a slightly different view. But I would tell you some of the great and good techniques that we absolutely want to bring forward and are relevant in any industry is their absolute fact-based drive for deep analytics on understanding cost. In fact, the automotive industries have entire departments that are as large, if not larger, than even the supply chain teams that do nothing but cost modeling. And they get down to the most granular level. Along with that, they've also for years have demanded cost transparency from their suppliers. I was actually there at the time, and I remember if suppliers didn't play by committing to giving cost transparency, they weren't even allowed to quote on the business. So, and that took a number of years, right? None of this just was overnight, but over the years, today they've got great cost transparency. They also utilize all of this data plus many, many more in building very strong, robust category strategies. And these strategies are built cross-functionally, and they're tracked and governed. A couple other quick items that I think the automotive industry really gets and that we are all starting to see at different pace in all of our different industries come into play. They understand that negotiation is 85% prep. It's not about the time at the table, it's about getting ready. 85% prep, 15% at the table. Things like value engineering, lean operating methodology are all excellent tools. And finally, the last tool, I call it a tool, it's taking a seat at the table. The automotive supply chain organization has earned over many years a seat at the C-suite, whether they report directly in or they're actually a member of the C-suite. That's a critical part to having a voice at the table. So what is the bad and the ugly? And you can choose if it's bad or ugly. Aggressive internal and external behavior. They are the 1,000-pound gorilla. And now I'm talking about the big, I don't even know if it's fair to say big three anymore, but the big auto companies. They are the 1,000-pound gorilla at the table, and they use it. You will read about supplier relationships, but the reality is they never really needed to get there because they are the big guy, and their suppliers, if they're not selling into one of those big automotive companies, they have a much, much more difficult business plan on their own. We believe at Shaw and so many of the rest of our companies, it's about being tough on the facts, but being respectful to the people. Not always the case from my experience, which is now 13 years ago in the automotive industry. They also had a lot of internal fighting. I swear, I was trying to remember, about 60-70% of the time, no exaggeration, they spent fighting about what counts. And we've all had that, right? As supply chain professionals in the room, there's always going to be that conversation to make sure your savings mean something to the business. But when you're spending more time negotiating internally than you are externally, something is very wrong. Finally, I would say the item that you don't want to bring forward is cutting supplier costs and cutting supplier prices at any cost. What happens is these companies will find ways to put money back into the price, be it through change control or some other mechanism, or worse, the suppliers become insolvent. And if you guys had been following the industry, probably about 10 years ago, the automotive companies had to plow a ton of money into their suppliers because they had a huge problem with bankruptcy, and therefore they couldn't ship, and a whole host of other problems began. So just in quick summary, at Shaw, I'd like to kind of maybe bring back, we've been on our journey for just over 4 years now. And when we started, our supply chain distribution was decentralized. We did not have demand management. We did not have strategic sourcing. We didn't have a team, tools, or processes. In fact, our business partners and engineers really negotiated that off the side of their desk. Today, we're very fortunate, and it's always step by step. These things don't happen overnight, but we now have a centralized distribution model where we have responsibility across Canada. We have demand management, and these teams together, we have lean operating principles, which I have to say is now benchmarked by others in other industries, are coming into our operations team, our supply chain operations team, and doing some benchmarking. Still a long way to go, but so far that team has unlocked over $100 million of cash flow. On the strategic sourcing side, we also now have a team in place that is doing the fact-based, doing the category strategies. We are building competency, and we are step by step becoming trusted advisors into the business. Is it across the whole business? Is it in every single department? Of course not. But we are making big inroads, and both our internal partners and our external partners see that we're raising the bar and that we're here to really understand the business and drive total value. So I hope that answered the question you had for me, Jaydeep.
Well, thank you very much, Janice. And I think what's fascinating about your experience is the fact that you've brought in manufacturing principles into what is a service organization.
And I am a firm believer that manufacturing or service lean principles, supply chain principles and practices are absolutely 100% applicable and invaluable.
Thanks. Mark?
So, I mean, I have the opportunity to have been in oil and gas now for about a year. So I still have a fresh perspective, but I probably understand a little bit more than I did a few months back. And Jaydeep has asked to give a bit of an oil and gas twist to my answer. And I'll start with a bit of an anecdote, and it is a true anecdote. I was with my colleague Steve, who's sitting here, meeting with the CEO of a software company a few weeks ago. And we were discussing around the implementation of ERP system and why so many of them have had mixed results in the oil patch. And he said something along those lines. He said, many supply chain people from other industries have come to oil and gas and have tried to change the world. And they've all failed, by and large. He said, our business model and our belief is that the oil and gas sector will not change. And we will build very flexible, very unstructured solutions to be able to accommodate that. So after thanking him and throwing him out, I just thought it's a good, it was a good insight. And it highlights something fundamental, is that our ability to drive value in oil and gas to the same extent as automotive, as aerospace, as distribution, will not come from tools, will not come from systems. These will be enablers. But I've seen more money being spent on tools and process re-engineering probably in one company in the oil patch that I've seen in total industry sectors over a 10-year span. So I don't know that's what is the challenge. It comes to one thing, it's willingness. So if we go back a few years in my aircraft world, the engineer whose sole purpose in life was to design the toilet handle for all the aircraft model, sincerely believed that if you were to outsource that engineering, the world and aircraft would go down in flames. Well, it was done, and industry sectors that have embraced the risk-sharing partnership model have emerged stronger. They have emerged more competitive. And I think, as Janice mentioned, most market segments have not gotten into supply chain because they suddenly, seen the light, or they talked to very smart people like Kurt that have told them it was the right thing to do. It was born out of necessity. And that necessity in the oil and gas today is at our doors. There's no way out anymore based on a $50 WTI, in the best case, going in for a few years. If we want to invest, we need to reduce our cost. You were right, Mike. If I move my head, I come and go with the signal. So please tell me, because I haven't found it yet, what is so unique about oil and gas in Western Canada that would prevent us from truly leveraging the value of supply chain from other industries? And I've heard a lot of things. You can take risk with production. This is a highly technical field. We have a very fragmented supplier base. We are at the mercy of market cycle. We operate in difficult location. Our work is project-based. There's a lot of good reasons. Now, how many of those reasons would not apply to building fighter jets under license in Taiwan or building luxury cars in Slovakia or in Mexico? There's no truly unique reason why we can't leverage that potential. There's one thing that is unique, and we've created it. It's the first time that I had seen in 25 years that from the worker on the drilling rig throughout the entire supply chain, people wake up in the morning, they look at the price of oil, and they start planning their vacations. Even in activities that have nothing to do with the price of oil, because of our behaviors in the last 20 years, we have created a direct link between the entire supply chain and the price of oil. And what does it do? Well, it makes us vulnerable to market fluctuations, which means we cannot make middle-term, long-term investment decisions with a good prospect for return. Because everybody is convinced that the day the oil goes back, the wages will go back, the margins will go back, everything will go back. And if you do this, you will never have stability. So we need to think as an industry how we're going to get out of that loop. We've created it, and we're reinforcing it when we start bidding for drilling crews to do the winter program. The last piece I want to touch on is if we want to move the needle, we need to have a bigger critical mass of people that can come in and say, I've done it, it works, and I'm willing to stick out my neck to prove it. And there is still a fairly minor part of supply chain organizations around town that have many people that have cross-industry experience, that are able to go and draw, in those automotive example, or Walmart example, or pharmaceutical example, to help bring credibility to the change that we are all trying to implement. We have, not to make it an announcement, but we have 2 managers' roles that are out on external posting. And out of over 100 resumes for each of those postings that we've received, I can count on the fingers on one hand people that had meaningful cross-industry experience. It's a challenge. And we either need to grow those competencies or we need to attract the talent. So I think the second question we need to ask ourselves is, why are we not marketable as an industry sector, as a city, for cross-industry supply chain talent? So just leaving you in a few thoughts. It's all about our desire to retain control. We have to be willing to let go and let our suppliers be accountable for the end result. And that's a very, very difficult thing, not unique to oil and gas, to all industries. The second one is, even within oil and gas, partnership models, risk-benefit models, risk sharing, they exist. They exist in the Middle East, they exist in Siberia, they exist in Asia. Why could they not exist in Western Canada? That's up to us. And the last one is a bit of an introspective thought. It's easy for supply chain to say, well, the business decides. We're here to help. We're here to enable. We're here to support. It means we need to take some personal and professional risk, stick our neck out, make some decisions, recommend some things that people are not comfortable with, and then follow through with them. No one will come and say, we would like supply chain to do this. We need to hone it, and we need to push it. And take responsibility for the good things we do, and take responsibility for the things that we're learning from. So I hope, JD, that it provided a little bit of insight on the fresh pair of eyes over oil and gas.
Well, excellent, Mark. And I think the value you bring is that you're bringing a fresh pair of eyes or philosophy to a key industry in this town. Thank you.
We have tremendous potential.
Kurt?
Thank you. It's a pleasure, of course. Like all of you, I'm listening with rapt attention to Janice and Mark. I'll see if I can add a few thoughts to their comments. You know, the idea of a burning platform that Janice mentioned and having a seat at the C-suite table, I mean, those are a couple things that the Western Canadian industries, I think, will have to look at. You know, $50 oil or below is certainly a burning platform. And the question of whether the C-suite is really listening to supply chain leaders, I think, is still up in the air. I'm going to take a little broader perspective in the sense of if we're going to learn from other industries, we better have the context within which to do that. So some of you have heard of the supply chain operations reference model. It's been around a long time. You know, what are we thinking about is supply chain when we apply to our industries in Western Canada? Plan, source, make and maintain, deliver, and then return are all relevant in our supply chain here. But it has to get more granular than that when you think about things like, what's the difference between project procurement and operational procurement? Especially in oil and gas entities, when capital procurement has been such a huge part of what we do, that is a very different play in terms of leading practice and where you can learn from versus operational procurement and getting the day-to-day done. And in either of those, the difference between goods procurement or services procurement, and this leads into what Mark was talking about in terms of relationship models and services that are outsourced. Oilfield services, engineer, procure, construct, contractors, fundamental elements of the energy and resources supply chain. So knowing where you're going to source those practices and how you're going to draw them into those key areas of capital procurement versus operational procurement, of services versus goods, become really key. And I found that that's one of the areas to go deep. So I'm going to give you my kind of top 10 list related to those things, and it may provoke a few questions from the group. And I'll tie it to learnings from other industries, from either the operations reference model or some of those key elements that I spoke about. So all of us know that information exchange, and today it's not information exchange in the supply chain, it's information exchange in a digital supply network, because every proponent and player is now networked completely, and that ability to exchange information is critical. So what do you expect from Amazon or from the courier companies whenever you place an order? You can trace that order from the moment you place it till the point you receive it. Can you do that with your capital project supply chain in your business today? And why not? You know, whether you're buying oil and gas maintenance equipment or you're buying large-scale processing units for refineries, where's the information exchange in the digital supply network? And certainly Amazon and the courier companies are the places to look. They solved that years ago, and it isn't that difficult to exchange information. Secondly, supply chain planning is fundamental. We all know that. Anybody in supply chain knows that. But how often are the procurement people plugged in at the front end of the capital planning process? How often are they really close to the EPC contractors that get hired to deal with some of the capital and project planning? And how often is it that usually procurement comes in way late in the game, up against lead time challenges for placing whatever orders, whether it's for the capital side or on the maintenance side? So where can we look for supply chain planning expertise? Well, that's very common in some of the defense industries from early in the game. They started with a project model. We talked about this over lunch. But they moved from a project model of building fighter jets to more of an assembly line model, which required more planning, more integration of procurement on the front end of that cycle. From my experience, we aren't doing that as well as we could in the energy and resources sector. So very key is sort of number 2 on the list. When it comes to services procurement, all of you know, if you think about refinery maintenance, if you think about any of your network maintenance, or if you're talking about managing an EPC contractor, these are big, large-scale companies. Like, as Janice says, in the auto sector, the automotive guys had a lot of clout. Sometimes the big energy companies have the clout. Sometimes they don't, depending on which scale you're operating under. But with the Bechtels and the SNC-Lavalin, those are global entities. We expect they're going to bring top-notch supply chain capability. They're engineering companies first. And are they really on top of the procurement? We ask of them to leverage multiple projects and therefore get the best deals. But if they're taking a project focus and doing project procurement, are we really getting that from them? So the learning from other industries is, how do you manage that relationship? How do you manage that supply connection, the supplier relationship model? And as Mark said, I think that's fundamental to us getting better. And we can learn from a number of industries. You look at Nike, you look at Apple, you look at any of the folks in the garment industry, they outsource all of their manufacturing. It's distant, it's halfway around the globe. Apple is one of the top-notch supply chains, and they don't manufacture a thing. They design a whole bunch of stuff, but they've got a manufacturing company that needs to meet tight delivery timelines. And somehow they manage to make that work across the globe and continuously with new product life cycles. So can we not make that happen in EPC contract relationships or refinery maintenance contract relationships, or indeed all of our contractor relationships? I think there's a key learning in there somewhere. The automotive manufacturers, I agree with Janice on that front. They are the big kahunas, except for Toyota and Hyundai had a difference. They had the Keiretsu and they had the Kabal in South Korea, and the difference was very closely aligned suppliers and a much more partnership approach. And that's one of the big elements that they were able to make successful when the big 3 were doing what they were doing, which was effectively dropping a hammer on the suppliers. So again, it comes back to supplier relationship management, tight connections with your suppliers. And I'll accept the point that in a cyclical industry like oil and gas, those suppliers will kind of work in their own interests when capacity gets constrained and whoever's got the most dollars makes it work. But I think we're in a burning platform, like Mark said now, that we've got a little more leverage around supply relationships and maybe building an oil and gas Keiretsu or something of the like. Then we talk about companies like pipelines, utilities, and telecom companies. And what are they really good at? Think about the reliability and maintenance that goes into pretty much 100% uptime, running a pipeline, running a telecom company, or a utility. We expect the lights to go on, they go on. Those guys know how to manage maintenance contractors. They know how to make sure that maintenance and reliability is done to a high degree. So can we learn something from that in terms of refinery maintenance, in terms of pipeline maintenance, or any of our well site maintenance? I would think there's got to be something there, and we can share knowledge. I think of a couple of companies I think are well represented. Repsol has had some folks here, and Repsol and Irving Oil did a lot of work a number of years ago with an LNG terminal in New Brunswick. I'm sure there's some takeaways from that. I was close to it only on the front end, so I don't have a lot to add, but that supplier relationship management, that global JV in effect, and the supplier relationships that were required to do that should be some really good learnings. And similar with Husky and the work that they've done off the offshore Newfoundland. It's a world away from head office, but the things that have, for example, gone on in the North Sea with remote delivery, with remote execution on capital and maintenance, applied to what Husky would do in offshore Newfoundland. Again, there's got to be some good learnings there, whether they're good, bad, or ugly, as Janice mentioned. So 1 or 2 left. The areas that are emerging now, we'll hear a lot about them. And this relies on us finding the early adopters. So robotic process automation, the Internet of Things and wearable safety equipment, cognitive and the analytics tools that are out there. Oil and gas, I would not see as an early adopter of many of these things, but where they apply. So robotics process automation for dealing with paper invoices, for dealing with the transition from a requisition to a purchase order. There are great use cases in place from early adopters that we may be able to learn from, which will take cost out, which will optimize that part of the supply chain. So those are a few thoughts, sort of a top 10 list. What the goal was really to provoke questions from all of you, because you got some pretty knowledgeable and experienced folks, mostly over here, that will be delighted to talk further on it. So Jaydeep, back to you.
Well, thanks, Kurt. And again, your value is that you know myriad industries, and so those points were great. I just have a question. Did you have risk mitigation in terms of a paper copy?
No, I did not. And I also didn't touch on sustainability. I imagine there's some folks in the room who want to talk about sustainability too. That's another area that risk and sustainability is pretty fundamental in supply chain.
Thank you. Thank you all. Before we accept questions from the floor, in the interest of time and relevance, I would request audience members to restrict questions to those that would be of general interest to the SCM community. And perhaps if you have very specific questions, perhaps leave it to after the event. I'm sure our guests will be around for a few minutes more. So, but as the moderator, I guess I can briefly usurp the event and ask the first question. We Calgarians are proud people. And so while you've talked about what Calgary can learn from the outside world vis-a-vis supply chain management, is there something that Calgary can teach others?
So I can jump in quickly on it, because I mentioned a bit about it. I believe the oil and gas sector and energy generally are top-notch at capital procurement. And when it comes time to deliver large-scale projects under tight constraints, remote locations, the expertise is in this city. I'm not convinced we do enough of a job connecting the EPC contractor capabilities, the oil and gas capabilities, and everybody is the expert. And teamwork and supplier management requires everybody to be a little more humble and learn from one another. That would be my initial perspective.
I know we talked about this question, but I didn't really, I thought it would be best to give it some thought as the panelists were talking, as Mark and Kirk were talking. Because we aren't the 1,000-pound gorilla, and we are in Western Canada, whether you're in telecommunication or oil and gas, we've had to come up with different business models that work. And as a supply chain function, I know for our team, I can speak, and I'm so proud that we have actually brought to the business different ways of being and different business models and approaches. I think we have the ability to think more creatively. And how do we work with our business partners? And when I say that, it's not words on a slide, because we can't afford to not truly partner with our suppliers, but in such a way that there's true value for everybody. At Shaw, we've completely changed the business model to be supplier industry-led, and we're working with large suppliers and pulling together the resources. And if we're looking at outsourcing or insourcing, but it's just the whole way that we approach the business, working with our business partners, I think is something that we can, in fact, and as Calgarians, I always joke around, we're not just Canadian nice, we're Calgarian nice, but it helps bring together more creativity and better business models that are sustainable.
I think maybe reinforcing what you're saying, Janice, what I found is there's a culture of collaboration. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of things that as individual companies we could not do, because best practices and learning and sharing and people move around different places. There's a way to leverage that as, not necessarily as an industry sector, but as a repository of good ideas that can be shared, that can be leveraged. And I was actually quite surprised by that when I first came in and said, okay, we're having that problem. Well, I know somebody who works in Husky. I think they went through that a few years back. Let's see how they solved it. And if we can actually harness that as a more structured network of ideas, there's probably a lot of mistakes we're making every day that somebody else has done in the last few months, in the last few years. So if we can find a way to do that, and we have the culture to do it, that can bring tremendous results.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, questions from the floor?
Okay, I've got a couple comments. But first off, to answer Mark's question about trying to get into the oil and gas with multi-industry experience, I can speak personally. It was very difficult to get into oil and gas. I've got Army, healthcare, transportation, and to get into oil and gas took quite a feat, despite the fact that supply chain is the same amongst most organizations. So on to my second comment, or sort of question, is my experience has been with healthcare, with railroads. Janice talked about it with the automotive industry. When industries consolidate or start cutting back, as happened with the oil and gas, my experience has been three things happen to suppliers. Either they go bankrupt, which we've seen a lot of suppliers over the last few years go bankrupt. They get bigger by buying out those companies that are going bankrupt and smaller ones, or they get bought out and they become part of a bigger entity. And so to hit Mark a bit there, the oil and gas industry, I think the suppliers are still going through that right now and still have a ways to go. And you know, sort of what's Jan, got a question between the two of you. What are you seeing in terms of that, your own experiences right now in terms of those industries, whether it be telecommunications or oil and gas or the other ones, because they're all interconnected, especially here in Calgary.
Well, you know, I think the technology is changing so rapidly. In normal business, there's always this life cycle, right? And whether it's M&A or it's smaller companies getting bigger or vice versa, I don't know that it is unique to telecommunications. Maybe it moves faster because the technology is moving faster. I don't know. I certainly don't know. Mark and I were talking. I don't know the oil and gas industry outside of what I just read, and you get through osmosis from living in Calgary. But we're absolutely seeing that, and I think that's the reason why category strategies and knowing your suppliers and understanding, you know, today we look at the global view, and often, I guess one example I would use, and I'm looking at my team in the room, Comcast is a big partner of Shaw. Now, they are such a large company, decisions they make will impact global suppliers that eventually also impact us. Because of a decision another MSO maybe has made. So it's incredibly important to just always have your pulse on what is going on. There's times that we step in the middle of the room, if you will, and we help generate those conversations, right? We partner people up, we marry people up, or we make decisions that we know will have a larger impact on a company, whether it's through supply-based consolidation or growth. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but I think it's just a normal part of life and a normal part of business. It's trying to move yourself out of being just reactive to that where you can and put yourself more in the center of the room and trying to be proactive or at least an active partner in how some of that shakes out as much as you can. I guess would be mine. I don't know if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's good market consolidation and there's bad market consolidation. There's probably people that have emerged and formed companies during the boom that shouldn't have been in business in the first place. Creating companies that have a critical mass so they can invest, they can develop technology, they can be stable is good consolidation. Creating 2 or 3 mega corporations that becomes monopolies that are unmanageable is bad consolidation. So it's our role as supply chain leaders to analyze those markets and see how we can help reinforcing good consolidation by not artificially keeping alive people that shouldn't be there or preventing certain synergies, natural synergies from happening. But at the same time, also not taking too much of a short-term approach and fueling consolidation to a point where, you know, the Frankenstein monster that you've created, you can't control it anymore.
My question is, thank you for the speeches, and if you all three can give me an opinion about the new grads. We all know that schools are not preparing fairly well or making grads competitive for supply chain in particular. So besides having a job shadow, perhaps a volunteer job, what else can grads do to kind of be more competitive for this field? Because it's fairly complex. Thank you.
Kurt, do you want to, it's up to you.
Yeah, a few thoughts. One, I think, and it was mentioned earlier, the oil and gas sector, in terms of willingness to change, has always been challenged, especially as the boom happens and we're growing quickly, and we need to execute faster on proven models rather than try new things. And then when things go down, it becomes very difficult to not just completely retrench, and there's no money to try new things. The generations are changing in oil and gas now. New grads are coming out with more nimble approaches, the later knowledge and better knowledge from across industry and especially globally compared to where things were, say, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So I think being able to bring that and sizing up oil and gas companies by how open and willing are leaders to invest in new ideas and try new things. Which oil and gas companies actually do have supply chain at the C-suite, if any? And how close to the C-suite are they? If you can do your research and figure out where do you want to be and where do you want to seed your new ideas to have some idea that they will take root, I would just encourage that because one, the industry needs it. Two, not every company is ready to take it on, especially now. But quite frankly, new grads are cheaper than experienced industry professionals. And guess what? In today's world, new ideas that don't cost too much and some energy to go with them, there's a value proposition there for many an oil and gas company. So that's the best I can offer on the top of my head.
Well, and since Mark put in a commercial earlier, I would tell you, just tell him to come to telecommunications. We're and don't worry about any of that.
We won't do a video.
We won't do that anymore. We're even. I think for new grads, it's important to have diversity and to understand the what and the how. The more they can do, whether it's internships, and make sure that you're coming into a company that's not going to just put you for 3 months into a cubicle and look at spreadsheets all day, right? It's about getting that depth, understanding business. A supply chain professional is not effective if they don't understand the bigger picture. And so that's would be the advice that I would probably give them in a quick snapshot.
Very often new grads will come into an interview and they will tell you, well, this is what I've studied, this is where I've studied it, I've studied under very well-reputed professors, and this is what I've learned. And that's good, that gets you to the door. Now, what ideas do you have to help me run my business is where many of those interviews then fall short. So my advice to new grads to be marketable is come in with ideas. Show me that you've taken the time to prepare and understand a little bit of my business and the challenges I'm going to, and provide a couple of insights or ideas. Here's what I would do. And they may be the most incongruous or irrelevant ideas, but you'll be able to demonstrate that you're capable of critical thought and creativity and imagination. And we need new solutions. We need to reinvent that business today. So that would be my thoughts.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, Terrence Kutrick with Alliance Pipeline. I'm looking for a very specific response to this. So what is the one thing that practicing supply chain professionals can do between now and the end of this year that will materially move the needle in terms of supply chain effectiveness in their companies?
I guess that will speak from Shaw, right? Because I think that's such a general, so I'll try to give you a very concrete answer. Absolutely partner with the business to disrupt ourselves and continue to drive total value to the bottom line. So you wanted a very specific, tight answer. And thank you, by the way, for helping sponsor the luncheon today. So thank you to you.
Yeah, I agree, Janice. And to riff on that and be a little more specific, two sides what a supply chain professional needs to do. One, what is the most critical initiative, concern, issue within your business? And get to know it really well and who's driving it, and find something you can contribute, so within the business. And then the flip side of it is, who is your most significant supplier that might affect that industry, that issue, or that concern? And what can you do with that supplier within the next 3-4 months to bring ideas, bring communication, bring something new, and put those two together somehow? If you can do that in 3 months, you may not solve it, but at least you're advancing the dialogue on the most important issue to the company and one of your most important suppliers.
I would echo Janice's thought somehow, which is get out of the shadow. There's been too many barriers to good ideas. And I think supply chain people have gotten used to keep those good ideas for themselves because they're afraid they're not going to be listened to, or they're afraid it will create confrontations internally. And I would say, take a risk. Don't care about the confrontation. Stand for what you believe in. Might get you fired, but most of
But he
the
has
time,
openings, so don't worry.
most of the time, it will not, and you will actually be, I'm looking at my team here, you will be rewarded for the courage and for having brought something in that maybe everybody's thinking about and are not doing. That disruptive part. Again, that collaborative environment I was talking about earlier is both a blessing and a curse. There's a lot of things that stay hidden because they could create conflict, or because make or buy is a very uncomfortable conversation. If you know that it may mean some departments within the company won't be there by doing it. But we're at the time where there should be no sacred cows, and everything should be put on the table.
You know, Mark, if I can, one word describes that, and we talk about it a lot, is tenacity. So, you know, I know that we've come at things in year one and maybe was told no 3 times, but the team kept coming back, putting together the business case, working with the stakeholders, and there's things we're doing today, like putting together the full end-to-end supply chain across Canada, or outsourcing some major elements that were always done in-house. They didn't say yes the first 3 times, but being tenacious with a business hat on finally did get us to where we needed to get to. So don't give up.
And bringing good data.
Always,
Everybody has good ideas.
always.
But if you have a good idea with good data, then you've just gone to the very front of the pile. And supply chain is a relatively new function. So you've got people coming from very diverse backgrounds that have grew into supply chain. And now I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but there's still a substantial portion of supply chain organization that could not run a business case with time value of money at every level. And it's hard to sell a good idea if you can't sell the business case.
My question is around talent for the future. And I think that's a great point you make, Mark, around most of us stumbled into supply chain, different backgrounds. You've got a lot of engineers in the room, accountants, what else, who've become supply chain professionals. And the future of supply chain is going to change. I think most of us expect that that's going to be driven by technology. My suspicion is that that's already happened in other industries, the automobile, the aeronautics. We've got Internet of Things, we've got robotics, we've got artificial intelligence. Those things are happening outside of the oil and gas industry. What do we need to do to prep our folks for the future of supply chain management?
So I'm glad you brought that up. To me, the thing I've seen throughout my supply chain career, which is way too many years, is talent management has continued to be the biggest challenge. Attracting, building, growing, and retaining top talent. And yet, we're better off today than we've ever been in terms of the schools that are putting out top talent and the capability of leaders that weren't in existence 20 years ago. So the question is, how do we do it faster? And I would say the oil and gas sector and perhaps forestry and other energy and resources companies are further behind in terms of crafting the talent and collecting the talent. The only thing we can do is forums like this, mentorship, guidance, building our teams. I know that almost every professional in supply chain will easily take a coffee meeting to talk to a student or talk to somebody who has the drive and energy to get into the business. Today is a pretty tough time in the Western Canadian marketplace for certain industries. We've got to take those mentorship opportunities. We've got to be willing to bring in people and bring some of these ideas to bear. And I do think it's going to be mostly within the industry and with the leaders who now exist to make that happen and to try and grow with mentorship and apprenticeship and just spread the network effect of that. What are your thoughts?
I'll do an analogy. I had a boss a few years back that said, I want everybody in my leadership team to think as a CEO, albeit working in different functional roles. Tomorrow's supply chain professional is the one who's going to be able to drive the supply chain agenda, but thinking like a CEO. While maybe historically, that topical knowledge and that functional knowledge was the key ingredient for success. Everything being so interconnected today and cross-functional teams for sourcing, more complex market structure, more interconnected data throughout different departments, the next generation supply chain professional who's going to rise to the top will be the one who would actually be able to succeed the CEO afterward.
Mm-hmm. I think just well said. It's something that we all struggle with, right? We probably spend as much time talking about talent management, talent development, than we do probably about any other single topic. I think I echo everything that Kurt and Mark said. We need to be working with the schools. We need to be bringing people in from different fields, bring in the lawyers, the engineers, the economists, as well as the supply chain professionals, and encourage supply chain professionals to get out into the business, into other areas, and then hopefully find their way back at a more senior level. It's about building that breadth and the depth, both formally and informally. I just think it's something that we can't ever take our foot off the gas, and we need to keep talking about it and keep getting it out there. But it's an area, talent, especially in Western Canada, for supply chain, it's just now starting to really resonate out here. You know, Eastern Canada has much more of a manufacturing base, which is a more natural, old school kind of linkage, but it's starting to grow in the service and oil and gas and telecommunications. So we just can't take our foot off the brake, and there's no easy answer. I wish we had the silver bullet, but it's got to be our top agenda item, and we need to drive it like we drive every other business problem.
And I think from the post-secondary perspective, many post-secondary institutions are looking at shorter postgraduate programs, such as a Master's of Supply Chain, where people can do it part-time and be done within a year, so that that is upgrading. So I think hopefully, even at the Haskayne School of Business, we are thinking about it, though we don't have any concrete plans yet. But down the line in a few years, I'm pretty sure we'll have something like a postgraduate degree in supply chain.
And if experience in other industries is any indication, the current challenges in commodity prices and in the oil and gas sector will actually bode well for supply chain. It's going to be a growth area because the focus on cost, value, quality of service, every other industry has grown and evolved, I would say, ahead of many of where we are now. We're going to see that happen. So it may not be the best of times, but it is not a bad time to be coming in with growth forward.
And it is a great time, I think, for people that are in this room. Mm-hmm. When the next sector that tumbles will be looking for talent and how to solve their problems. If we've solved them in the oil and gas sector and we're able to make that transformation, then we are all more marketable to that other industry being able to bring those best practices that we've developed.